So good afternoon. Um, as usual, it's great to be able to present at Kindred's Sustainable Gambling Conference. My name's Jonathan Parke. I'm director of Sophro, which is a consultancy that does research and education in the area of safer gambling. By way of background, probably describe myself best as a psychologist that's interested in gambling behavior. And specifically at the minute, what we're most interested in is looking at the relative risk and potential harm that comes from different gambling products. And that's what we're going to talk about today in the 15 minutes that we have. Um, we're going to share findings, preliminary findings from the first study in a 3-year collaboration with Kindred. Myself, Professor Paul Del Fabro from the University of Adelaide, and Maris Catania, who is head of RG and research at Kindred. So, starting from the top, bit of background and a bit of context. So, what is product risk? So, to some extent, it's relatively obvious when we express product risk as the extent to which a product is likely to increase the risk of gambling harm. Although it's important to consider the fact that it's quite broad in the concept. So, it includes the game, the features and options within a game, but also the platform through which that game is presented, particularly online. The assessment and the management of product risks are becoming increasingly important. So, for example, in some jurisdictions, regulators are expecting operators to have a good understanding of the risks that come from certain products within their portfolio of games. And not just that, it's about taking action when you have that understanding of risk to try to mitigate the risk of harm. And for me, one of the biggest challenges and one of the things that makes it complex is often the thing that makes a game potentially risky can also be the same thing that makes a game fun and exciting. So, what do we know about product risk based on previous research? So, in this figure, what we're looking at is a summary of a range of different studies from a range of different locations and by different research teams. And if you have a look, we have used those studies to rank the level of risk by study. So each dot in each of the panels there represents the finding from the study. So as you can see, where there seems to be quite a lot of consistency in the research is that slots are typically ranked the highest risk in the studies. All the way down to the bottom where lottery draws typically are rated among the lowest risk products. You'll also notice that there's quite a bit of variability in a lot of the products and the findings in the studies. And to some extent, you would expect that because these studies are using different methodologies. They're looking at different jurisdictions. Um, one product in one jurisdiction may be quite a bit different to what's legally permissible, for example, in a completely different jurisdiction. And of course, some of these studies vary overall in terms of their quality. So you'd expect a little bit of variability. So, with those caveats in mind, it's still useful to try to summarize what we know. And based on the evidence so far, lottery draws tend to be the lowest risk, followed by scratch cards. Bingo, poker, racing, and sports betting tend to be moderate risk. And then casino table games and slot machines tend to be highest risk. Importantly for this study, one of the motivations for starting off looking at this particular set of research aims is because, to our knowledge, there hasn't been a study that's looked at product risk specifically comparing only online games. And the other thing that we wanted to look at is consider some of the product categories that haven't really been looked at least to a significant extent, in other research. So, for example, esports. And so that's one of the reasons why we wanted to see how the findings from this study compare to previous research. So, as I say, this is a first in a series of studies. It was part of a 3-year collaboration with Kindred, and the broad aim of which is to try to increase the level of evidence that we have around product risk, with the ultimate aim of contributing to processes that are more practically useful to try to assess product risk and to try to mitigate product risk. As mentioned, the aim of this very first study is to look at broader categories of product and a few subcategories of product where we had the data available, and to see which are most strongly associated with behavioral risk. And again, here we're looking at behavioral data, looking at actual player behavior, rather than looking at self-report data from surveys, which the vast majority of the previous studies have been using. So for this first study, this was largely exploratory, but we did have some initial hypotheses about what we'd expect to find, and some of them are fairly basic. We were predicting that the continuous activities in the games, such as, for example, slots, would be more strongly associated with elevated player risk, and that less continuous forms of gambling, such as poker and bingo, would have a lower association. And also, where data permitted, we looked at some differentiation within the product categories, where we predicted that in-play bets would be relatively higher risk compared to pre-match betting. So as I mentioned, we are really only a couple of weeks into this collaboration, and to get the ball rolling, we looked at what data were readily available. What could we start looking at right away before collecting new data? And so the data that we used in this particular study were the activity involvement and the different involvement in subcategories of gambling. And it's at a basic level. So, for example, whether somebody had participated in a particular activity over a 6-month observation period. And in terms of the outcome variables, well, we had two. Again, those that were readily available. The first one was Kindred's Player Safety Early Detection System, their PSEDS. Now, this is a risk detection algorithm that flags risky play for the responsible gambling team to deal with. So, along with that, as a proxy for risk, we also use net expenditure. So, money spent, not necessarily money that was staked overall. So, just a quick snapshot of the variable of the sample characteristics. As you can see, we had quite a large sample size, and this was the entire sample population. So, everyone who played at the unibet.eu website who played a game once over the last 6 months. And as you can see, it was a predominantly male sample that was relatively young. And there was a significant association between gender and age, such that women were slightly older than men. Okay, so on to preliminary findings. So what are we looking at here? In this first figure, we're looking at the odds being flagged as being at risk according to participation in a particular product. And again, this is using the PSEDS designed by Kindred. So what we mean by odds ratio, if I give you an example, if you look at racing, and you can see that the odds ratio for racing is 4.0. So essentially this means that if you had placed a racing bet once, at least once, over the last 6 months, you were 4 times more likely to be flagged for exhibiting risky play, risky behavior. And the levels of risk using this metric were ranked from top to bottom. So you can see the two riskiest products using these metrics were racing and slots. The next two were esports and a calculated variable we called unpopular sports. Let me just give you a quick explanation of what that means. In previous research that we did with Kindred, we found that those who were scoring higher on the problem gambling severity index, they tended to play more obscure types of sports, like, for example, Russian table tennis. And so we wanted to construct a variable looking at the least common, more obscure sports within the broader set of sports markets to see if we could replicate that finding here. And as you can see, we have replicated that finding. And then tapering off, you have a range of different products in the relatively lower risk category. You'll see there's a product called mini games, and a mini game is essentially a slot game that you can play in the same window simultaneously while you're playing bingo. I think it's interesting to note that with those mini games, those types of slots, they had a much lower odds ratio compared to the overall category of slots up there at around 3.5. Mini game slots were about 1.7 in terms of odds ratio. And then right the way down to bingo, which was overall the lowest relative in terms of risk to the rest of the products. So this second figure, what we call a bubble plot, it's taking the same odds ratios that we just looked at, but it's overlaying on top of it the level of participation. So you can see there, if you look at racing, and just a quick explanation, the larger the circles, the greater the level of participation, and the darker the color of the circles, the higher the odds ratio. So if we look at racing, you'll see that a very small proportion of the sample actually participate in this type of activity. So overall, 0.2% of the sample placed some kind of racing bet once, at least once over the last the 6 month observation period. However, if you compare that to these products, um, you can see that there's a high level of potential risk according to the odds ratio, but also a high level of participation. And the reason for this figure is we think it's quite useful because you can get a snapshot just by looking at it where the potential burden of risk lies, if we can call it that, within a product portfolio. So, in terms of prioritizing research, in terms of prioritizing safer gambling strategies, these would be the products looking at this in terms of participation as well as the odds ratio of where to focus the resources. So, this third figure, we use what data we had to look at some of the variations within product. And in the existing research literature, there's emerging evidence that if you bet pre-match as opposed to in play, it's a protective factor, it's lower risk. And indeed, in this study, this is what we found. Um, in terms of sports betting, you can see that the odds ratio there was 0.33, which essentially means that if you had placed at least one pre-game sports bet once over the last at least once over the last 6 months, then you're 3 times greater odds of not being flagged as exhibiting risky play. What was interesting, though, that this finding didn't hold for racing. So you can see that the pre-race only bets were almost as high in terms of their odds ratio of being detected for risky play as other forms of racing bet. So we found this interesting. I think one of the key takeaways from this slide, though, is if, and this is something that we had anticipated coming into it, but there's some debate about, if we're looking at trying to identify risk with accuracy in a meaningful way that you can take action on, it seems clear that because of the level of within category variation, in other words, not all sports products are equally risky, not all slots products are equally risky. It's very important not just to look at the broader category of risk whenever you're trying to plan your research or whenever you're trying to develop effective safer gambling strategies. And we find that again in this fourth figure here. However, the outcome variable is median monthly expenditure across the Unibet account. So as an example here, we believe this is the highest median monthly net expenditure. So if you had placed a combination bet on a racing event at least once over a 6 month period, your typical spend, your median monthly spend across all activities was just over 75 euros per month. And when you compare that to the single bets pre-match on sporting events, the combination racing bet is around 9 times higher overall. Also, you'll see that, again, as in the previous figures, the higher risk products tend to be the ones that are played the least. Finally, the other thing that we draw attention to is this idea of within product variation and risk again. So here we have 3 different types of sports bets. On one hand, we have the multiple bet in play on sporting events where you have over 45 euros median monthly net expenditure. So again, that's 5 times higher than the single bet pre-match on sport events. So there's quite a lot of within product variation. So some thinking about these findings, what are some of the preliminary insights? Well, again, focusing back on the whole point of this was the first step to get an idea to see how broad categories of product compare to the previous literature. Here, we were comparing only online products, whereas the vast majority of previous studies you were using a range of both land-based and online gambling. So what did we find? Well, we did find, as one probably would expect, that there were quite a bit of consistencies with different findings from previous studies. So faster, more continuous activities like slots and in-play betting um, were higher risk, relatively speaking, and slower, less continuous activities such as poker and bingo were coming out as lower risk in relative terms. But there were also some findings that were less consistent. So, for example, we found that racing was the highest risk product overall, both in terms of median expenditure, but also in terms of players being detected um, using the PS EDS algorithm for detecting risky play, but also table games and roulette, such as roulette and blackjack, were coming out as lower risk. And both of these took us a little bit by surprise, and these are things that we want to look at in more detail in future studies. There were also some findings that are, at least for us, seem to be relatively new. They're dealing with topics that haven't really received much attention in previous research. So finally, if we consider some of these findings and some of these insights, I think it's useful to just bear in mind some of the methodological issues relevant to this study. So while there are, we think, this methodology, there were quite a few strengths, most important of which we think was a very large sample size representative of the Unibet player base. We were looking at actual online gambling behavior as opposed to self-report data. At the same time, we think there were quite a few limitations that you have to bear in mind as well. I think the most significant of which is that the involvement measure was incredibly basic. So we simply had information about whether they had played that game at least once over a 6-month period. So in future research, we want to look at the intensity of involvement, the style of involvement, how frequently were they playing, how did they play, what stake level did they use, how much did they spend, and we want to look at those variables in relation to the products and the games and the types of features that they have. And also in future research, we want to beef up the outcome variables that we have, and so hope to use measures such as the problem gambling severity index and also potentially measures of gambling harms. One thing to bear in mind with this type of research is that it might not generalize to all forms of gambling. And particularly if we're looking at Unibet, individuals who gamble with Unibet, they may also be placing online bets, playing online casino at another provider, or maybe playing offline. So it may not reflect all of their gambling activity. So that kind of wraps up where we are at the minute. Our biggest takeaway is that it's been reinforced to us the importance of looking at not just the broad categories of product, but focusing in on the variations within products. And there's a lot to look at there because if you take something like slots, you have potentially hundreds of different structural characteristics. So you have hundreds of different types of variations within each category. But it's something that we're going to look at in coming studies. So thank you very much for listening. We may have time for 1 or 2 questions. Whatever questions we don't get to, please feel free to get in touch and we'll be happy to answer them by email. Thanks again.